Like I was introduced, today I'll be speaking about some of the common myths and realities when it comes to cannabis. As you guys know, there's myriads of myths out there when it comes to cannabis, ranging from anything you can think of. I'll stick with some of the more common ones that have to do directly with using cannabis, especially medicinally. So hopefully I can clear up some things for everyone and definitely answer some questions when I'm done. Pardon me if anyone has any. All right. Perfect. Okay, so today kind of what I want to touch on is a bit of an introduction about myself, about Tweed, the role we play in the cannabis market. From there, I'm going to move on to myths that are related to cannabinoids, THC, CBD, things like that. I'll move on to effects and dosing, and then from there, myths kind of about legislation around cannabis. So like I say, we'll cover some basics and hopefully clear up some myths that are out there. So a little bit about Tweed. So we are Canada's largest licensed producer of medical cannabis. We're just in the booth actually, just right behind you guys. So as a licensed producer, right now, we grow and sell cannabis to anyone who has a prescription for cannabis. Currently, that's the only legal way to get cannabis here in Canada is with a prescription. And so that's the role that we play. There's, I think, close to 235,000 Canadians who do have a prescription for cannabis. Tweed itself has close to 72,000 customers. And honestly, as many patients as there are for cannabis, there's probably just as many individual reasons that people are using cannabis. It's all across the board as to why people decide to start using cannabis. So it's a really cool industry in that sense. As far as myself goes, so I started in the industry actually as a grower. So I grew the plants for Tweed, and then from there I was able to transition to helping customer service on the phone. So I would speak to individuals who had questions about strains, cannabis, talked about myths all the time, tried to clear some things up. And then from there, I was able to move into community engagement. So I go out, talk to people about cannabis, just kind of build some relationships and just give some education out there. Now, myths about cannabis can really influence how you use cannabis. And so by clearing up the myths, we really hope that we can make cannabis a responsible product to use it safely, and even if you aren't going to be using cannabis, with legalization coming up, just being able to be a little bit more informed about how cannabis is used and why people choose to use cannabis. So we'll start with cannabinoid profiles, THC, CBD, secondary cannabinoids, things like that. So myth number 1. THC and CBD are the only two cannabinoids that matter. Very common myth, and certainly THC and CBD are the two most common cannabinoids. They are found in the highest levels in the cannabis plant, and they're the active ingredients, as you guys know. THC is more of the high associated with cannabis, and CBD is more of the physical relief that people get from cannabis. Definitely needs to be considered when choosing your strains, but not the only thing to consider. There's what they call secondary cannabinoids, and these can be things like THCA, CBN, CBG, and as more and more time goes on, these secondary cannabinoids are starting to get quite a bit of their own reputation for the benefits that they can provide medicinally. Along with that, outside of the THC and the CBD, there is also what we're called terpenes, and terpenes are what influence the taste and the smell of cannabis, along with some other effects as well. Now, the one nice thing about cannabis, because it is THC and CBD, and then all these other secondary cannabinoids, is you can get what's called the entourage effect. So you may be choosing cannabis simply based on its THC and CBD levels, but then you get the benefits of this entourage effect because of the other cannabinoids that are existing in the plant. So certainly to begin with, THC and CBD important, but keeping an open mind that the terpenes, the secondary cannabinoids are something else to consider as well. So moving on to myth number 2. If you are using cannabis medically, then it would be medical cannabis that is high in CBD with no THC or high in CBD with low THC. Very common myth as to medical cannabis just being CBD products. And like I was saying before, with so many different people choosing cannabis for so many different reasons, CBD is not the only products that medicinal cannabis covers. So, pardon me, I have a tickle in my throat, you guys. Pardon me. So, THC could be used for things like sleep, anxiety, appetite stimulant. People will use it for PTSD. It also is very helpful with pain as well. So, like I say, medicinal products are not only going to contain CBD. It can be CBD on its own, combination of the two, or THC on its own, in high levels, certainly, depending on why you're using it. So like I say, that medicinal market has just as much variety in it as far as the CBD and THC goes as the recreational market, we may call it. So like I was saying before, another common myth is that CBD is just for pain management. Not accurate. THC also plays a role in pain management as well. It's been shown to have those same kind of body relaxation effects, anti-inflammation, things like that, that can really also help with pain management. As well, it can also help you feel a little bit less anxious, a little bit more relaxed, calm, help with sleep. So when considering pain management, CBD doesn't need to be the only thing that you need to think about. And in fact, I used to talk to people on the phone and they'd say, you know, I'm using CBD, I'm not finding it effective. And I would say, maybe start to consider some THC. If you're finding CBD on its own just isn't doing the trick, then THC may be something to consider. On top of that, THC and CBD actually complement one another. So they kind of bring out the best in one another. So when used together, they sometimes are even that much more effective. So like I say, the choice comes down to experience level, your comfort level with THC, and certainly it's not for everyone, but like I say, with pain management, CBD doesn't need to be the only thing that you consider, definitely. Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Okay, that's better. Okay, all cannabis smells the same. Very common misconception. It's stinky, it's skunky, it's gonna smell gross. Not the case. So as I was saying before, with those secondary cannabinoids, like the terpenes, that's what's going to influence the taste and the smell of cannabis as well. So some common terpenes are myrcene, very herbal, earthy smell. That one certainly does lend itself more so to that kind of skunky-ish smell that we associate with cannabis. Pinene is another terpene. It's a very, it smells like pine, very crisp, very fresh. Another terpene is caryophyllene. It's a very peppery smell. It's spicy. Limonene is a citrus smell. Linalool is found in lavender, so it's a floral smell. And it's this makeup of all these different terpenes that influence the taste and the smell. When I was a grower, there would be strains that would be almost tropical. They'd have a very high limonene terpene profile, a very high caryophyllene profile, giving it a very tropical, sweet taste and smell. So when you are considering your strains and you want to stay away from certain tastes and smells, then it is that terpene profile that that you want to take a look at, because not all cannabis has that same really skunky, stinky smell that's associated with it. All right, next myth. Indicas should only be used at night and sativas only used during the day. That's a really common myth. And in fact, it's funny, I was talking to my coworker before I started the presentation, and she said, you know, it's really funny, like I always thought indicas were going to make me tired. I should only use indicas at night. They're not going to do me any good during the day. When in fact, a lot of people find indicas just as helpful during the day. They can, as you guys know, indicas are very calming, very relaxing, at a high enough THC level, certainly very conducive for sleep, which I think is why people do associate it much more with using it at nighttime. But based on the THC level, certainly during the day is a really common time to use an indica. Give you those feelings of calmness, relaxation, maybe help with some anxiousness, pain management, things like that. And same goes for the kind of that hard and fast rule that sativas are only for the day. Again, certainly not the case. If you get home at the end of the day, you want a little bit more energy, a little bit of a perk if you've had a long day, sativas may definitely be beneficial. And cannabis affects everyone differently. I would talk to people who would prefer sativas at nighttime. They just found that that's what worked better for them. And like I say, it depends on the person. But definitely keep a very open mind that if you see that it says indica, not necessarily for nighttime, that can be just as useful during the day based on the effects that you want, the symptoms that you're trying to relieve, things like that, for sure. All right, effects and dosing. Essentially getting the most out of your cannabis. And cannabis can be tricky as far as effects and dosing goes. There's a lot of trial and error associated with cannabis, so we'll see if we can kind of clear up some myths to make that a little bit easier to do. So myth number one, with a prescription for medical cannabis, your doctor decides what product you'll use and how you will use it. Very, very common myth. In fact, when you get a prescription for cannabis, the only two required amounts of information on that medical document are A, how much you're going to be prescribed, and B, how long the prescription is for. So as far as what product you're going to choose, when you're going to use it, how you're going to use it, the dose that you're going to use, all of that comes down to you, the individual. So you really kind of have to flip your thinking a little bit when it does come to choosing cannabis medicinally, because you are in the driver's seat. When I would talk to people on the phone and their medical document had been submitted and they say, okay, what did the doctor say I should take? And it's not like that. You get to choose. That's the nice thing. If you find a dose that you're using isn't working, increase it. You know, if you're finding a product you're using isn't working, change it. It's a lot of trial and error. You really have to reach out for support. But like I say, you are in the driver's seat when it comes to choosing cannabis and using it medicinally. And a lot of people, that can be a bit of a struggle at the beginning. People are looking for a lot of direction, but ultimately you get to be the decider. And for myself, I think that's one of the positives of using cannabis, is you get to decide for you how you want it to help you, what kind of symptoms you want to relieve, and what kind of benefits you want to get from cannabis. The other thing I always think about cannabis is I always view it as part of a larger treatment plan. So depending on the reasons that you are using it, you know, it may be only a very small part of your treatment plan. So it really comes down to the individual with how they want to incorporate cannabis into their regime. Okay, you will always get the same effect if you're using the same strain of cannabis. So, you know, you're at home, you use a strain of cannabis, you get really great effects, and you think, you know what, I'm going to bring this to the barbecue, share it with my friends, and you don't get the same effect. That definitely is quite common. Like I say, if you're using the same strain, you should get the same effect. But it really depends on so many more factors than that. The setting is a big one. Are you by yourself? Are you with other people? Is it a quiet group, a big group? Those effects can also depend on your attitude going into it before you start to use the cannabis. If you're feeling tired, if you're feeling upbeat, depending on the severity of the symptoms you're trying to treat, if you're using it medically, that can all influence how it's going to affect you that time you use it. The other thing that influences how it's felt is how the delivery method, essentially. Whether you're smoking it, vaporizing it, using an edible, that's also going to influence how the effects are felt. As well, the older a product gets, sometimes the cannabinoid profile can change a little bit. So if you have a product that's been sitting on your shelf for 6 months, it may not give you the same effect from when you used it the first time. So, like I say, using the same strain isn't necessarily going to give you the same effect every single time based on the other factors that are going on around you. All right, another common myth. Using edibles is a guessing game. There is certainly some truth to this. You kind of hear that, those stories of people, they didn't feel anything, and then suddenly the effects of the edibles were just way too strong. There's really no way to control that. That's not quite accurate. There are definitely some tips and some tricks that you can use to make using edibles a little bit more reliable. So, for example, if you are making edibles, stirring it really, really well, distributing your product throughout the batter or whatever you're making really thoroughly is a huge thing. You don't want that, that corner piece situation where all of the product has kind of ended up in that one corner and whoever the unlucky person is to use that has a lousy time at the party. So stirring, not letting it settle, that's a really, really big thing. The other thing that I always caution people, go low, go slow. Nice tiny dose, keeping in mind it can take up to 2 hours for those effects to be felt. You don't want to be, popping another piece 10 minutes because you didn't feel the effects, and then suddenly, boom, it all just hits at once. The other thing to keep in mind when you have edibles, especially if you're sharing it with the group, stick with nice mild strains, ones that aren't going to be too overwhelming when the effects are felt, so that based on people's experience levels, everyone can all have a good time. Certainly, it's not as precise with dosing as some of the other delivery methods, but like I say, doesn't need to be a total guessing game when it comes to edibles. All right, another myth. Unless you're feeling high, it's not working. And this is pretty common that I came across when I would talk to people with their prescriptions. And I think what it comes down to is deciding for yourself what kind of results and what kind of symptoms you want to relieve when using cannabis. Because certainly you don't need to feel high to feel its benefits. CBD obviously has no psychoactive effects to begin with, so if you're using a CBD product exclusively, you wouldn't feel any of the effects of being high. But if you are using products with THC and you want those benefits of the THC, more isn't always better. So like I say, what you really want to think about when you're using THC is you may use an increased amount, you'll get those effects that you're looking for, and you'll think, I like these effects, I want to feel them even more, so you'll continue to increase that THC, and then you tip past that point where it's enjoyable or beneficial, and you fall into that trap where you're just having a lousy experience when it comes to cannabis. So, like I say, going into it, being very, very mindful of the symptoms you want to relieve, and then pausing and stopping when you're starting to feel those symptoms being relieved is really important. The other thing I always really encourage people to do is record what you're doing. When you're using your cannabis, how you're using your cannabis, how much you took, because you may be surprised at the low level of cannabis you need to get those benefits that you're looking for. The other thing to consider, which is becoming a little bit more popular, is what's called microdosing. And what that is that's using small amounts of cannabis on a daily basis where you're not going to feel the effects of THC when you're using such a small amount, but But over time, it kind of builds up in your system, and just generally people have found that it's made them feel just generally less anxious, has helped with their sleep, feel a little bit more relaxed, things like that, but they don't actually have that experience of feeling high the entire time. All right, the bad trip, the bad high. So another myth, there's nothing to be done when you have a bad high, you just have to ride it out. Kind of like the edibles thing, there is some truth to that, but again, there's some tips that I can give you that can really help with that experience. So, you know, if you've ever used cannabis, it is always something that you're worried about of getting that bad experience, but there are some tricks. Number one, stay calm. It is going to pass. You can't overdose on cannabis, so you may feel miserable, but it's not going to hurt you. A couple things to consider is CBD counteracts the effects of THC. So what some people will do is they'll maybe use a strain that has a high amount of CBD in it to try to counteract the effects, or they'll always use CBD when they're using a strain with THC. Another thing to consider is the smell of black pepper, or even the taste of it. That can help bring down the feelings of a really bad high, so that can be helpful. I usually tell people, go to sleep, you know, try to lie down, have a shower, stay where you're safe, stay where you're comfortable. It is going to pass, it's going to get better. The effects of using cannabis dried usually last a couple hours. Edible is a little bit longer, and so it'll fade, it'll pass, it'll go. Another common myth about cannabis is you will always get the munchies if you use cannabis. Munchies and cannabis seem to go hand in hand, definitely, and it's not always the case that you'll get munchies if you're using cannabis. There's strains that give you that feeling a lot more strongly than other strains. So strains that tend to be higher in CBD, sativa strains, they don't tend to give you that feeling of the munchies the way a higher THC indica would. So if that's a concern for you and you want to stay away from that, your strain selection is going to play a part in that. For some people, that's specifically the reason they choose cannabis. They want to stimulate their appetite, so certainly there's strains they would turn to more so than others. And just like the other kind of myths we touched on, there's tips if you want to kind of combat those feelings of the munchies. That could be, like I say, the strain that you're using plays a big part in that. But also, if you're bored, you'll probably tend to, want to munch on something. If you're around others who want to eat, I usually suggest to people, have a glass of water or carrots or grapes or something close by that you can snack on those instead if that feeling comes up. Because some people certainly view it as a negative thing, but you can definitely combat that. Like I say, based on the strain, based on some other little tips, and keeping in mind that that is the specific reason that some people actually do turn to cannabis. Okay, legislation. As everyone knows, seems like I can't turn on the news these days without some kind of story about, the upcoming legislation with cannabis. So definitely there is some confusion when it comes to legislation about currently how it is and how it's all going to play out in the future. So I'll hopefully be able to clear up a couple points as far as that goes. So myth number one, with a prescription, you can legally carry your cannabis anywhere. This is a common one, and it's one that I always really like to clear up. With a prescription for cannabis, you can legally carry cannabis within Canada. You can't cross any kind of international borders. Even if you are going to a country where cannabis is legal or a state where cannabis is legal, it doesn't matter. You cannot bring your cannabis out of Canada to bring it with you. You can fly, drive, wherever you want, coast to coast, but as soon as you try to leave Canada with it, that's when you can really, really run into a lot of trouble. So it's something to keep in mind. I've talked to people before, and they're like, I'm heading over to whatever, Amsterdam. I was going to bring my product with me. And it's like, well, no, you can't leave Canada with it. So it's a really important one to keep in mind. Another myth, with a prescription, you can legally purchase cannabis anywhere. People think that with a prescription, it's a free pass. I can go wherever I want, I can get cannabis, and I can legally carry it. Not accurate. With a prescription, you're registered with a licensed producer, and that's who you legally get your cannabis from. You can't get it from any other licensed producer that you're not registered with. You can't walk in anywhere and get it face-to-face. That's still considered illegal. You're only getting your product from the licensed producer that you are registered with. And the other thing that goes along with that is that that product is for you. That is your product from your licensed producer. So like I say, that card, having that medical card, isn't just a free pass that you can go anywhere. And in fact, right now, getting your cannabis legally, ordered online, sent through the mail. So any kind of face-to-face locations currently, it's still considered illegal. Obviously, that's all going to change once legalization rolls around, but right now, that's where it stands. Another thing to keep in mind is that you can be licensed with more than one licensed producer. So if you want to increase your options of the kind of products that you're getting, you can have X amount of grams with producer A, X amount of grams with producer B, and that would allow you to have a little bit more selection. But without having that specific medical document for that licensed producer and without being registered with them, you're not going to be able to access their product. All right, this is a big one, that the recreational market will replace the medicinal market of cannabis. So people currently with their prescription, they'll say, well, what's going to happen when it becomes legalized? And for those currently with a prescription, you're probably not going to notice much of a change. You'll just keep on doing what you're doing, ordering from your licensed producer, you'll have the variety that you'll have, and you'll just keep doing your thing. In addition to that medical market, we will now have the legalized market, the recreational market as it's being called, and that will be regulated completely separate from the medicinal market, and it will have its own rules and restrictions around it. Some people are kind of in limbo. They're like, legalization is coming up. I don't really want to go through the hassle of getting my prescription. What are the benefits of getting my prescription? And certainly in my mind, there are still some benefits with getting a prescription. There's nothing set in stone yet as far as when legalization is going to happen. Everyone's still saying summer, but we're privy to the government. So it really, in theory, could take longer than that. The other thing to consider is that right now there's really no direction as far as what kind of products are going to be offered on the recreational side of things. So medicinal customers may find that they end up with a little bit more selection just based on those restrictions that the government may have for the legal market. Each of the legal markets is going to be based on province by province. So the way it's set up is really just going to depend on what that specific province thinks is right. So like I say, in my mind, still worth it to get a prescription, but beyond that, just to reinforce the fact that the recreational market is not going to replace that medicinal market. It will just be in addition to. A really cool change for Canada in my mind. We're the first G7 country to legalize cannabis across the country. So it'll be a really, really cool experience when it does happen. I'm sure with its own ups and downs and trials and errors. So again, why a prescription is still a nice, safe bet. But it'll be exciting to kind of see how it all plays out. So those are pretty much my most common ones. But are there any other questions that I can take? Any other myths that I can help clarify? Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'd come over the microphone if you wait 1 second.
Even better.
Is the recreational and the medical marijuana the same thing?
Same in the sense that medicinal cannabis has just as much variety and strain selection as what we would call recreational cannabis. But like I was saying before, at this point, we don't know if there's going to be any kind of restrictions from the government as far as what we're allowed to offer legally. So there may be a slight bit of difference, but like I say, the variety in the medicinal market is just as much as it is in the recreational market.
And the way it's produced for safety reasons and pesticides and things like that, the product that comes out of Tweed for medical is going to be the same as for recreational.
Yeah, so with the federal government still kind of being in charge of the legalization and whatnot, there will still be obviously government oversight in the industry as far as quality of the product goes. Currently on the medicinal side of things, there's a myriad of quality assurance points that a licensed producer has to meet to offer the product, and I don't see any reason why those same strict conditions wouldn't be in place for the legal market as well.
Okay. And just another kind of benefit to stick with medical, I think, is that you can use your purchases for medical marijuana as a tax write-off.
Yeah, that's correct. You can write them off. Yeah,
Which is
it's out of pocket, but you can. Yeah.
But recreational, you couldn't do that.
I can't imagine. No.
No. So it's a big plus to have it as a write-off.
Fair. Very good point. Absolutely.
My question actually is around dosing suggestions when it comes to people who are going through chemotherapy, for instance. What would be your kind of recommendation for that?
Absolutely, it's a good question. That would really depend on what kind of symptoms you're trying to relieve, whether that's going to be symptoms that are pain, sleep, appetite stimulant. And what a lot of people will do is they'll choose different products. So they'll say, I have a different product that I use at night to help with my sleep versus the product I use in the morning to help with my aches and pains and stimulate my appetite. So, like I say, based on the symptoms themselves, often people end up choosing more than one product. And of course, the biggest thing it comes down to is just your general experience and comfort level as well. Someone who has no experience with cannabis, I wouldn't suggest using like a really high THC product until they felt comfortable with it. So that plays a part as well. But with chemotherapy specifically, sometimes having a bit of a bigger variety of symptoms that people are trying to relieve, people often find more than one product to be the most beneficial route to go. Yeah, exactly. It depends on the symptoms, for sure. Yeah.
We have a question here, and anyone else?
Will medical marijuana be taxed differently than recreational marijuana? Do you know at this time?
From my understanding of it, potentially, yes. It may be taxed differently between the recreational to the medical side of things. Right now, it's just basic, provincial taxes applied to your medical cannabis when you purchase it. But when it becomes recreational, whether that's going to be like a set X percentage, I don't know. Probably once again, province by province. I really don't know yet.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Back here. We've got him, and then we'll go to you.
Could a pharmacy apply for a licensed producer's sales license?
That's an area that I don't have a lot of understanding about, to be completely honest with you, what that relationship is, whether pharmacists can directly supply the product to the individual in a face-to-face environment. Right now, like I say, it needs to be ordered online or through the phone and then mailed. But whether those regulations will change, I don't know a lot about that side of things. Right now, no. It's not an option, but it may very well be in the future.
Could you recommend who I'd contact to get clarification on that?
I would say that might be more on like the regulation side of things, maybe more so on the government side of things, as whether they would allow that or not, because it would be them who would ultimately decide whether that was how that would all play out.
Okay.
Definitely.
Hi, I was just wondering, any health plans will cover the cost of marijuana?
That is a very, very good question. One that I get a lot. right now, cannabis doesn't have a drug identification number, so the government can pretty much be like hands off. Certainly, I've spoken to some individuals where there's been private insurance companies or workplace coverage based on the circumstances will cover it. I know Sun Life just came out recently saying that they were going to play a bigger role in covering cannabis. So on a government level, no. I think probably as time goes on, it'll be out of like the private insurance companies that we see that becoming a lot more common. Definitely, but too early to tell. And it's unfortunate because like it's not the cheapest product in the world, and so then for people to have to spend all that money, it's kind of a bummer. But hopefully that changes. And like I always tell people, like make noise, like talk to people, tell them it's important. Like it's not going to change unless people know that you're not happy with it. So it's a big thing for sure. Yeah.
Any other questions? I haven't missed anyone? Okay, let's have a round of applause for Michelle.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for your patience with my scratchy throat. Appreciate it.
And I'm sure if you want to go back to the Tweed booth at any point today, Michelle will be able to answer your
You got it,
questions.
guys. Yeah. Any other questions? We're hanging out back there. Come say hi, see what's up, and I'll be happy to chat about cannabis.
Thank you once again. Coming up at 1:30, we're going to hear from Cheryl Schumann. She's going to be speaking about the future of cannabis. I believe that's about 10 minutes away.